20th, and at long last, after virtually 4 weeks, the whole of November, it's mild enough to get out trapping. The question is, where am I going? At the moment, I have no idea whatsoever. Well, as you can see, I did manage to find somewhere and eventually decide, after much driving about, exactly where I'm going to be trapping, and it's here in Sherwood Forest this evening. It's a part of the forest that I came to twice this year, and hopefully we'll get a few moths. I've no real idea of what to expect in terms of species or numbers. I've got a rough idea, but whether those species are about and in decent numbers will remain to be seen. But we should catch something. It's lovely and mild, couldn't really be better. Well, there won't be a deal to ride in this evening. Don't know the temperature yet, thermometer's only just gone out, but 16:40 will be the start of the trapping session. I say I'm not expecting much. It'll be just interesting to see what we get, and the chance to actually catch a few moths. The weather since the 2nd of November, which you can now see there, has been very poor. I should have ticked those off, sorry. My OCD says I need to tick those off. But that's the species that we had last year, no, earlier this month at Gamston Wood: December moth, November moth, feathered thorn, Eclaris morgana, Epinotia maculana, red-green carpet, satellite, northern winter moth, Merville de jour, Eclaris variegana, Blastobasis lacticolella, Frutella xylostella, and green brindled crescent. Let's hope we get something near that number of species, but it's very doubtful. The fun thing will be in finding out. Now, our first moth is already in, and with this being Sherwood, it's not a surprise to see that this is a chestnut, always one of the first moths in if you trap during the late autumn right through to the very early spring. And as I mentioned before, you can sometimes find this moth sat resting on the trunks of silver birch. But a nicely marked moth. There's a bit of wear to some of the wings, but very nicely marked for a chestnut. Sometimes the markings can be quite plain, or they can be quite worn. One aspect of this moth which makes it stand out for me is the very shiny, almost waxy appearance of the wings. But this one is very contrastingly marked with various darker markings. So a nice one, but not surprising moth to get. The first one in so far, so let's hope it's not long before we're joined by others. At least we've got a moth. Well, the thermometer has settled finally on 13 centigrade, and it certainly feels like 13 centigrade. It's very mild this evening. I don't think tomorrow evening's going to be as mild, but we'll see. Maybe we'll get another trapping session in on the first day of December. But promising conditions. It's cloudy, predominantly cloudy. So a few little chinks I've noticed as I was driving in here this evening, but those chinks of clear sky will probably fill in as we go through the next hour. Rain is forecasted by about dawn, I think, so hopefully we'll get a few moths in. We have the two species in so far, chestnut and northern winter moth, and I have seen the odd moth flying around as well. So it looks like we may well get a few moths after all. Now I know this isn't gloriously exciting and gloriously colourful, but this is another moth, and in fact this is the third species actually. We had December moth in. This is northern winter moth. Now northern winter moth is slightly larger than winter moth and usually better marked than winter moth. In Sherwood here it's especially common, often the commonest of the two species, that usually flies a little bit earlier than winter moth. Winter moth seems to have a longer flight span, but I didn't see this come in actually, and there it was on the far side of the sheet. So not much to look at, but a moth's a moth this time of year. Now here's something of a surprise, but I have a sneaky feeling we had this last time I trapped here, but this is an oak nictioline just come in, and quite an inconspicuously marked oak nictioline. They can be very, very beautifully marked and very contrastingly marked. A number of forms of oak nictioline and a very characteristic shape. It looks very Tortrix-like, in fact it looks like a large Tortrix, but it is actually a macro moth. A nice one to get. Not that common a moth in Nottinghamshire, but I've done quite well this year. I think this may well be the third oak nictioline of the year for me, and a nice one for tonight's trap list. Well, I'm just waiting for my cup of tea to cool down a little bit. Not usually this hot out of the flask, but we're doing well. And two surprises have come in. Oak nictioline, which I didn't expect, although it's not unheard of, because obviously oak nictioline hibernates as an adult, and Dilys and I have recorded it in Sherwood Forest on a number of occasions, and I have a sneaky feeling that I recorded it the last time I trapped on this particular spot. But that's a nice one to get. The other interesting thing that's turned up is a silver Y. Not incredibly unusual, of course, but it was immaculate. Looks very recently as though it's hatched out, although there has been an arrival of migrants in the last day or so, and there's another quite chunky looking moth down at the bottom there. That'll be interesting to see what that turns out to be in a minute. But the other species that have come in are Clarius ferragana. That's the only micro at the moment, and they now 3 northern winter moths and just the single chestnut and December moth. But a nice little total. I'm not expecting great things. You have to think that we're right towards the end of the year now. It's the last day of November. I'm just happy to get the chance to catch some moths after all. And to think we had snow less than a fortnight ago, I'm quite surprised that I'm sat here. Well, here's another surprise. Although, in this day and age, perhaps not, but I can honestly say that this is the earliest that I've had a Pale Brindled Beauty. But there again, I've had Pale Brindled Beauties in January, which would certainly make them early of any year. But I've never had a Pale Brindled Beauty in the beginning of December. In fact, I don't think I've trapped one before New Year. And this is probably one of those species or one of those moths that's something of a sign of the times, to be honest, because certainly with us having that short cold spell with the snow and then some frosty nights, maybe that's induced this to appear earlier. It's nice that it has, and we'll see if it settles down, we can have a look at it. This was one moth that I wasn't expecting this evening, but many of the moths that we typically associate with the very early months of the year have showed a tendency now to start appearing just that bit earlier, and quite often before Christmas you can get one of these. A lot of people do, and species like common quaker can turn up, and Hebrew character. One of the interesting aspects to moth trapping and entomology is the changes of species' flight times. It's an ongoing thing and something that we're hardly ever likely to be able to change. I didn't expect this. What else is going to turn up? And here is that Pale Brindled Beauty. You can see that the male here has beautifully feathered antennae. The female are virtually wingless, and so of course are flightless. You can sometimes find them on the trunks of trees by day. But although this is a very common moth, and we'll be seeing lots of these after Christmas, once we get into January and February and March, the appearance of this on the 30th of November is something of an extreme date for me. It's a nicely marked moth. It might not appear it, but this isn't the best marked Pale Brindled Beauty that I've seen. Some can be a little bit more contrastingly marked than this, and some can be completely dark and devoid of any marks at all. But it's the appearance of this moth so very early that makes it worthwhile. It just goes to show, never put your trap away. Well, the December moth count is presently up to 7. I suspect maybe 1 or 2 more, but there's at least 4 active on the sheet. A couple have sat and settled down. Always nice to get December moth. It's a beautiful moth too. Nice to have such a lovely mild evening and be getting a number of moths. We're doing very, very well. As another December moth thuds into the proceedings and joins the developing frenzy. They tend to do that a lot, that you can see as one goes along the cable there, almost like a tightrope walker. Where they do lots of this before eventually settling down, but they can take 10 minutes, quarter an hour or so to settle down. But they're fun to watch buzzing around the sheet. They're great little moths. December moth really is an attractive moth. It might not be particularly colourful, but in terms of its dark coloration, it's unusual in UK moths. Beautifully hairy on the thorax, well built for flying in the colder months of the year, and at the back of the head you can see there's that sort of very pale brown, straw coloured collar, and the rest of the thorax is a lovely chocolate, a very dark chocolate colour. And the wings, even though they may appear black, they are very, very dark grey to me and quite matte in colour. There's a broken line of cream coloured markings, and then another bit of a dash on the leading edge of the forewing, and then there's that checkerboard pattern and the hairs on the back end of the wings as we look at it from this angle. It's a very attractive species that you can catch at home, and this one has a friend. It had a friend, but what a beautiful moth. I love trapping this time of year where many people don't bother running the trap, and if you do just trap from home, it's hardly ever worth trapping, to be honest. If you're confined to some suburban or even urban areas, trapping in the winter will not bring many moths at all. If you're fortunate enough to be able to get out and about and trap in some local woodland, that's where your entertainment will lie. But say, I love this time of year. One of the reasons is that very few people are trapping in winter. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. And it certainly helps you to appreciate the common moths of the time. In fact, the quite mundane and muted coloured moths that we have. We've gone past the beautiful autumn coloured moths. We didn't have many of those this year, but at the moment things look pretty good for moths flying late in the year and early into next year. I couldn't not trap between sort of October and April. I couldn't do that. Sometimes, even though you may well get a little bit tired of moth trapping and yearn for a few weeks off, after those few weeks off you're yearning to get back out with the trap again. Well, at least I am, and I know many other people are too. But it's nice just to take myself off into some local woodland and run the trap for a couple of hours on nights like this. What could be better? Well, an hour and a quarter of this trapping session has lapsed, and we're doing very well. 12 species we're up to. I didn't think we'd get anywhere near there, to be honest. And there's still one, maybe two species which should be on the cards as turning up. But of the species that I haven't mentioned so far in this video, and the last three species which came in, Agonopteryx heracleana, nothing particularly special about that, and that's just a micro, of course, but had winter moth in and feathered thorn. Feathered thorn hasn't hung around. That would have given us a little bit of colour for tonight's proceedings, but the December moth total is now up to 12, so we're doing particularly well for December moths. Who knows what's going to come in? You never know, really. But it's nice to see a good few moths on the sheet, even though the majority of them are indeed December moths. You can't complain at this time of year. Well, while it's settled, and hopefully this won't get smashed into by one of the December moths which continue to come in, but here's that feathered thorn. Just a slight bit of wear to the tips of the wings, but what a beautiful moth it really is. Sometimes these can be really orangey red, and other times they're a much paler sandy coloured brown almost, but beautifully marked, with one almost straight line across both wings and one more irregular towards the base of the wings there. And then, apart from whatever ground colour the moth has, there's that dusting of darker scales. It's an absolute beauty and a nice thing to see late in the year. Well, if you've never trapped moths, or if you've never trapped moths into the late autumn and winter months, I believe that you're missing out. I say it's not always possible for people to get out and about in the way that I can, and to visit and trap at some of the sites that I can too. I'm very lucky that way, and I'll admit that. But if you think that mothing during the winter months is moth free, you might be sat outside freezing cold for 2 or 3 hours to maybe catch a moth, or hopefully catch a moth. Most times you're going to be very wrong. If you pick a night where the temperature isn't going to go down to about anything less than 8 centigrade by dawn, and you can get out to your local deciduous woodland, this is the kind of scene that you can get. Lots of December moths here, All the species have arrived too, and some that I expect, as I've mentioned, haven't come in yet. Mottled lumber, I would have thought I would have had by now. What a hobby. We're just over a couple of hours gone in this trapping session, and I'm getting ready to pack up. I'm quite happy just having 2 hours. I've got a chance to sample to see how the populations are doing here in this part of Sherwood Forest, and certainly concerning December moth, there's no worries at all. December moth is around in really good numbers, and these are probably the best numbers that I've ever trapped. Contrastingly, I've only had just the one chestnut. I thought I was going to get several chestnuts early on, but it's remained at just the one. That is quite worrying, and certainly continues the trend of poor numbers of chestnuts this year. And I can feel some rain. So, a very profitable 2 hours. Ended up with 12 species. I'm more than happy with that, because I didn't expect anywhere near it. Right, pack up time.